That sounds good. Probably around 1:40, I'm going to get on a city bike.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, to go pick up your kids?
Yeah.
You picked them up on a city bike?
Well, I will dismount once I pick them up.
Okay. My story is like full of overlaps. Like I've done multiple things at the same time.
Yeah.
So in my 4th year of university, like my final year of undergrad, I was also working with Google. At the same time, I was like collaborating with them on a couple projects around accountability. And then when I graduated my undergrad, I started working with AI Now. So that's when I moved to New York.
Yeah.
And then I did a Mozilla fellowship for the last year. So I've been like
still in New York, or did you go to?
No, I went back to Canada. I went back to Canada because it was a lot of flexibility, so that was really helpful. But yeah, I think like in general, I've sort of had to play this because I wanted to be able to see from the inside that question of how do we hold internal stakeholders accountable for their organizational ethical expectations. If I'm at a company where they claim to care about fairness or they claim to care about privacy, what are the mechanisms that I have as an engineer to be able to think about and reflect on some of these high-level principles? What are the resources I have to communicate with other internal stakeholders about what I've done to address these issues? Stuff like that. Like that's all the internal accountability stuff, and that's all the like documentation frameworks, and that's a lot of what it means to be like internally accountable. But then on the other hand, I'm like really fortunate to have worked with like Joy and Kathy and other people that are very much on the outside of these systems. They have no sort of contract relationship with the organization that they're auditing, and they have a completely different set of tools and a completely different set of strategies for how to evaluate the systems and hold them accountable and poke at the systems. So there's these sort of like two modes. Like there's the internal mode, which is like very much the guy that's trying to do the right thing as they're building it and trying to communicate to other internal stakeholders about what they're doing and trying to live up to the expectations of the organization. But we already know, even with Google, right? Like there's limits to that. Every organization,
I'm not exactly sure what the phrase "even with Google" means. But,
I mean, like, you know, you're right. But I think Google was this like kindergarten color, you know.
They certainly have kindergarten colors.
Really
that's true.
Good PR for too long, you know.
Like
they were really seen as this like responsible AI like hub for a long time. You know, they had. I think it's the kindergarten colors. They just had these bright colors. People were really attracted to it. Everyone wanted to work there. Even people in like the ethical AI space were really into it. And it wasn't until recently that people are realizing that even Google has this situation where they still want to make money. So in the case of Megan Timnit saw some issues with developing these large language models, some ethical issues with that. They thought that critiquing that technology was in alignment with Google's AI principles, so it wasn't like them contradicting anything that Google had sort of like publicly declared. But once they started speaking up about it, because it's so closely tied to the product roadmap of what Google wanted to do with those models, those two ended up getting pushed out of the company.
Yes.
So
my concern is
for me, it's like there's limits to like internal accountability mechanisms, but they're useful for the reasons we mentioned. They're useful to help, like, you know, engineer communicate with product manager about ethical expectations. They're useful for like writing things down and like maintaining a record, right? So internal accountability is like, it's useful to do stuff from the inside, but it's limited. And then doing stuff from the outside is also useful. It's really useful to like, you know, take an API and evaluate a system and like write a paper about it, or challenge the company or like sue the company, which is what ACLU does. It's also useful to be on the outside, but also limited because you don't have access.
Or perhaps to work for Lena Khan at the FTC and like push for regulations.
Yeah, literally, I think that's FTC is super encouraging right now.
So let's agree there's lots of weapons at our disposal, and hopefully everyone will pick up whatever weapon is closest to them.
Why do you call it a weapon? Like what's the
forces? Weapons for good. You know,
weapons for good.
Do you come to bring peace, or do you come to bring a sword?
It's ironic to say that, but sure.
Yes,
I know what you're saying.
It's a martial rhetoric. And it's not going to be easy, right? They're not going to make it easy.
Yeah.
So it is going to be a fight.
Yeah, it's always going to be a fight. From the inside or from the outside, it's always going to be a fight. Like the other challenge is that like, and I've been having this conversation for a couple weeks now, is like the people bringing up these issues are not those that are most easily listened to. I'm noticing it's like a lot of like younger people, a lot of people of color, a lot of women that bring up these issues, and like they're sort of like the most easily dismissed. So it makes it even more challenging, and it makes it even more of a challenge to like actually get these companies to care about this and like address these issues. Yeah.
Yes, the literature is dominated by women scholars and women of
Yeah.
color
Yeah.
scholars.
Which
Absolutely.
is like super interesting to me.
Amen.
But also it's coming from this place of like me, Joy, and Timnit are black women, and we
Yes.
don't think that's a coincidence because we all have had personal experiences of being misidentified with facial recognition. So when Joy kind of came up to us and like was talking about this project, like we understood immediately what she was talking about.
Yes.
And I know as a fact she's had this conversation in terms of her experience with being misidentified or you know, having technology fail on her. She's had that conversation she's tried to have that conversation with other peers, and like it was harder to get it. Like
And,
me personally,
and people say it's an edge case.
yeah. I had a conversation with my manager at the time. I like tell this story all the time, but like he was genuinely like, it's so hard to get data. Like, why would we think about demographics? Like, what are you talking about? Like, it was just so weird to bring it up at the time. Obviously now it's a mainstream topic, so like way more people understand what's going on, but for a really long time it was just like this like minority voice being like, this is an issue, and then other people being like, I don't understand why that's an issue. And that happened for like a couple years before it became like sort of a well-known established idea. Yeah, so I don't know.
Let's get back to the Deb trajectory, because I'm realizing that, like, you know, you and I met, I don't
be
even
a
know
bio.
when. We met when you were in New York for a summer.
Yeah.
You were like,
And this was,
third year
so you actually
undergrad
met me
or something?
before I did any research thing, which I find really remarkable. I'm still like, I appreciate you being really nice to me at the time, because I literally hadn't published anything. I don't know if you remember, I had a conversation with you.
we met at the Times.
Yeah, we did. And
We
I
met
was like,
at
I was like, should I
Clarify,
do
we met at the
research,
Times.
or should I do like a startup or something? I
Did
don't
I
know if
give you good
remember
advice
that.
or bad advice?
Yeah, and then you were like, oh, you should just do research, just try it or something.
Okay.
And then I was like, oh, cool. Yeah, you gave good advice.
Okay,
if you had
good.
given bad advice,
I'm
I wouldn't
terrified.
say
Yeah, 'cause I remember.
it. Do you remember anything about like your own life, or it's just
It's
all a blur?
kind of a blur. There's just a lot happening.
It's fair.
I
It's
don't
fair.
remember. I remember
my
we
brother
did
says,
it.
like my dad says once you have kids, it's like everything is
Absolutely.
just no memory, and I'm
And
like,
with 3 kids and
it's
like
very terrifying.
I'm there's like 3 kids and 2 jobs and 2 books and a nonprofit.
Yeah.
There's just a lot. And then there's
How
this
are you
crazy
sure-
this crazy virus is going around. There's
Oh,
just like
yeah.
there's just a lot going on.
Sidebar.
Yeah. So what do you think needs to be done? Like, what do you think human beings need right now for
As a society, or what is the ethical AI team kind of the ethical AI sort of movement need?
for the way
I know those are
that
very
for the way
different
that
questions.
for the way that algorithms and algorithmic and data empowered algorithms are mediating or are impacting negatively
yeah.
our political, personal, and professional realities. What do you think
Yeah.
needs to be done? We talked about
Okay.
regulation. We talked about internal. We talked about
Oh,
external.
yeah.
We talked about research.
I have
You know
a lot
research.
Of, yeah,
Do you have thoughts?
I have thoughts.
Let's hear
I'm
'em.
curious what your thoughts are after. If you want to share them, I don't know if
Sure.
you're allowed to share them, but yeah. So my thought is that I'm really leaning into this idea of third-party auditor accountability being very crucial. So I've been, for the last year, I mentioned one of the reasons I left AI Now and started the fellowship was to begin to work with the Algorithmic Justice League and get involved in policy, not just American policy, but also the EU has a lot of policy developments. And one of my big goals in doing that is to make sure that we end up with these systems where these algorithms become sort of visible in a way that they're not. So it's very easy for you to go through your entire life having a lot of decisions being made about you by an AI system. What your salary is, if you get social security benefits or not, if you get your tenant application approved, if you get your resume seen by a recruiter. All of these decisions happen with AI tools, but very rarely is it visible. So when you end up with a decision that makes no sense or that confuses you or that frustrates you, there's no way for you to actually understand that the failure or the issue might be tied to or connected with an algorithm. I guess the most extreme case is a defendant that might be given a really high bail or denied parole or something, and having an algorithm be factored into that decision, but them not being informed about that. A lot of the cases that we see of especially in the criminal justice context of people becoming aware that false facial recognition badge is what led to my arrest. It's them overhearing a police officer, while they're in the jail cell, or their lawyer being really diligent about FOIA requests or something like that. Same thing in immigration. A lot of the ways that people find out that AI is involved or facial recognition is involved is the lawyer being super diligent with FOIA requests and demanding a lot of information. So I think one is this notice of where algorithms are being used and how is really important. And then there's sort of the second part of it, which is like those of us that do audit work from the outside and that engage as third-party auditors. So like, again, third-party auditors are these like external auditors, like sort of looking from the outside at these systems and scrutinizing them and pointing at them and really like revealing any weaknesses that can become like, you know, fatally problematic. So like I feel like those third-party auditors need to be like legally protected and like legally empowered and supported through like very strong policy. And I think that like creating an ecosystem where that's possible, where it's possible for a third-party auditor to like truly analyze the system, scrutinize it, and reveal certain flaws, and then have the companies or the institutions involved be held accountable for any of the flaws that are revealed or any of the harms that they perpetuate. I think that like that for me is like the ideal form of accountability for this kind of thing. I think it's very hard to come up with regulations in terms of like what you were saying, like a universal like ethics code for all of AI. I think will be very difficult to execute, especially given like, you know, different domains of applications, different types of algorithms and things being presented as AI. Like I think it's, for me, like the path forward is allowing third-party auditors to safely kind of probe at these systems and like reveal these weaknesses and reveal these harms as they arise. And having that be fed into like a very robust sort of like regulatory regime around that. Like what does it mean? I think the FTC, personally, I'm like excited about the potential of the FTC in the US playing this role of like an algorithmic watchdog almost, or facilitating other algorithmic watchdogs to report to the FTC and have the FTC take either legal action or another form of action against those companies that like violate whatever standards are in place. So that's like my like idea of like what I really think the next step is, or like what's like a feasible next step. I think that is a much more sort of like grounded approach, because the reality of it is like we don't actually know the full scope of harms. Like we don't know the full range of ways AI will hurt people. So this idea of like a policy whack-a-mole where you're just like coming up with ideas of how AI could potentially hurt people and then regulating that away to say like, oh, you can't do that because we're worried it's going to hurt people in this way, or you can't do this thing because we're worried it's going to hurt people in this way. Like it's like very incompatible with just how like fluid AI systems are. So I'm very much like now advocating for like just make sure the system is like visible and open enough and accessible enough to third-party auditors, credentialed third-party auditors, and it could be regulators as well, but just like make it so that, you know, regardless of whatever form the AI takes or whatever kind of harms are perpetrated, we have a way of just like questioning the system and scrutinizing it and poking at it, and then holding it accountable as a result of that. Like being able to sue, being able to pull something off of the market, you know, like consequences as a result of the scrutiny. So yeah, that's like my ideal, like what I think we should do next. But that's like very personal to me, obviously coming from my experience of dealing with these systems in like an auditor capacity.
I do think that I'm reticent to point to only one device.
Oh yeah.
I'm actually much more engaged thinking about all the different devices and how just to even think about a taxonomy of all the different tools we have at our disposal.
Yeah.
State power, individual power, even corporate power. You know, different companies deplatforming each other effectively. Like when Apple says you're not allowed to sell Facebook's app on my app store anymore if you don't change the policy. That type of deplatforming of Facebook by Apple is a type of check on power happening within corporations and each other. And then within state power, I'm very interested in the way that in the States, we often think about like federal or nothing. Like if the U.S. federal government doesn't do something, then it's not a regulation. But as you know, like there's, you know,
local intervention.
Yeah, the city of Somerset can decide we're not going to have facial recognition in our city, or in the state of California. The state of California says it's going to do something that has impact. Or GDPR, right? If you're a company and you want to be active in Europe, you know, something it's not a U.S. regulation at all, but for multinational companies, it has an impact. So I'm much more interested in actually just being a little bit taxonomic about what is the role of state power, what are the forms of state power, what is the role of corporate power, what are types of corporate power, including deplatforming or just releasing tools, you know?
Or recalls, actually. Like we had like Amazon this is due to a lot of advocacy and like reputational costs that was incurred. But like Amazon definitely kind of got cornered into this place of being like, we're going to impose a moratorium, you know, and we're going to do a voluntary recall of this facial recognition product. Yeah, and Microsoft did the same thing.
Did they really use the word recall?
They did not use the word recall. They used the word moratorium.
Okay, because I ask about that because the metaphor of recall has always been really interesting to me around software as a service. Like if I have a bad car, it's a real hassle to recall the car. But if I have a faulty API or a faulty software as a service, it's actually not that hard to shut down. So when people talk about like, oh, the algorithm's misbehaving and it's bad and it's causing damage, in my head I'm like, it's really hard to recall a bad hammer, but like you could just turn off that API, just shut down the input.
This is my major qualm. I use the word recall just because I also feel the same way. I'm like, it's not that hard to just take it off of the market when it causes harm. It's really fascinating to me because when people, when let's say bias is revealed in a particular product, they'll say like, oh, we're in the process of like redesigning this product and we need to do this and we need to do this. And it's just like,
that's interesting.
It is so easy for you to just take it off of the market. Like while you're figuring it out, it is so easy for you to just stop selling it, like stop.
Right, but you're pointing out something I hadn't appreciated about the downside. So the other thing that I think is useful as a taxonomy is let us stop thinking about AI as somehow not a technology because it robs us of the lessons we've learned from harms from other technologies.
What do you mean by that?
Well, like seatbelts in cars.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Adam Mosseri the other day said, Instagram is just like cars, which was a hilarious thing to say because, it's like cars, and those are hella regulated. So I just think as a species, like we've been using technologies for a long time and we've learned how to use them. But somehow AI gets this otherization where we're like, oh, let's not learn anything we've learned about the history of technology for AI.
This is great because I mentioned I was at a conference this morning and it was a very sort of like lawyerly conference. A lot of people had like a legal background and it's really fascinating how like policy and legal people talk about AI. I think anyone with any kind of like engineering background is aware like this is a built artifact. This is a technology. This is not like a humanoid type thing. This is just like technology in the same way that a car is technology, right? Or a toaster is technology. But in other contexts, you'll have people sort of debating, like, should we give AI, like, rights? They'll
I have heard that.
They talk really strangely about responsibility as well, where they say, like,
I don't know, man, that just seems a little Star Trek-y. Like, I feel like we've got real problems with AI right now. Rather than let's make up new problems about how does AI feel about things. Like, we've got problems right now.
Yeah, and then they'll sort of say, too, like, it's, and I found it so fascinating, because I was like, this is so far from the reality of what the technology is, right? Like right now we're dealing with a bunch of failures, like it barely works. So the idea of talking about AI as like anything like semi-conscious is just like too beyond the realm of what we could even imagine kind of type thing.
I mean, maybe in another, I don't know how many, 50 or 100 years, I'll be glad that they thought about it. But like right now, like house is on fire. Like could we
like take out the fire before imagining the next like world or something?
That's my thinking. Maybe I'm short-sighted and have limited imagination.
Well, I don't know.
But I want to come back to this thing you just said about recalls and whether recall is a good metaphor.
Yeah.
Because I've always thought, it's so hard to recall like a faulty hammer or a faulty car, but you can just shut down an endpoint.
Yeah.
But
for sure.
The other thing you just pointed out is the flip side of having a malleable API, which is like every time the press reports on any technology,
for sure.
The tech company is going to say, "Oh, well, that's out of date."
Yeah.
Because
we had that with Amazon. Actually.
Because we've totally changed the infra since that document that was leaked.
Yeah.
But of course they've changed, the algorithm because every tech company is constantly tweaking its algorithm. So it's sort of vacuous to say, oh, that intel is out of date.
Yeah.
So, but it does give companies an out, as they can say, well, yes, actually that did, destroy civilization or whatever. But we updated the API and that was version 3.8.
Yeah.
Version 3.9.
Yeah. Doesn't have this problem anymore.
So that is one thing that's good about a recall is like everybody knows whether you had like this model of Pinto car that explodes or something like that.
Yeah. There's a like, I don't know, like if we want to compare it to cars, because I've thought a lot about cars versus AI or machine learning. I think data is this really important difference where like, there's no part of a car that is sort of like a derivative of like human experience, which is what data kind of can be. So the conversation around privacy and the complexity of that is not involved in cars. And then there's also the reality of the fact that like the data hoarding involved in machine learning, and just like the current strategies for AI today make it sort of like scalable in a weird way and like contextualized in a weird way, where like the data is coming from a particular context, but then might be applied in another context. So there's like specific things. It's like, well, you can talk about cars built for winter, you know, being used in like another environment or something, but it's like very, very different. And I think that kind of complexity makes it really tricky. Go ahead.
Okay, no, I was just going to say, you're right. Maybe it's a little sophomoric of me to say, well, let's just use what we've learned from centuries of technology, because you're right that data-empowered algorithms do rely on data, and data is sort of more like an asset that's harvested rather than a technology that you build. Yeah, it's definitely like a different type of technology, but I think it's also like worthwhile, and I haven't really seen anyone do a good job of this, is like it's definitely worthwhile to map out the differences between software and AI systems. I think like there was a really good paper that was talking about like software engineering practices, right? Where like if you're building really good software, here's all the things that you need to think about, and here's how you need to arrange like your process. And then kind of compared that quite implicitly to like what a machine learning engineer does. And there's just like a lot of chaos to what the process is. Yeah. Software engineering, there's such a sense of responsibility. Same with cars, with like unsafe at any speed. There's just like such a sense of like, I am making this engineering decision to like build the car or like build the system. And, you know, like when I make this choice, it results in this outcome. Whereas with like machine learning AI, like, so many people make so many implicit choices around where to get the data, how to label the data, and it just kind of escalates in a way that's hard to track and impossible to see because it's not very interpretable. And then you end up with a system where it's like you're not sure what the relationship is between the decisions you're making, like the input and the output of what the system is doing, and like the impact of the system. But the other thing is data and objectivity.
Okay.
Meaning, well, like people who work with data, I think, want to believe that what they're doing is objective.
Yeah.
And so what you just called choices, I often call subjective design decisions. So, you know, if you look at Gina Neff's paper, Critique and Contribute, she talks a lot about the way that data science teams are constantly making little subjective design choices, even though they think of what they're doing as objective because it's got data in it, right? And it's linguistic regression, it's linguistic regression or whatever, you know, it's totally objective. So I think maybe if I'm designing a car, maybe I have some sense that I'm making subjective design choices, and maybe that's part of my value add. Whereas when I'm designing an ML algo, I'm like, I'm doing something objectively true, and I'm just allowing the data to speak. You know, that was a thing we used to say decades ago.
I don't know if you saw like Ziad's audit of hospital assignment, bed assignment algorithms, where they were pretty much saying like, so
that was a good paper.
Yeah, it was a really great paper, and I thought the like most fascinating part of it was just sort of the fact that the solution was not a debiasing technique. It was sort of
don't use this algo.
Yeah, don't use this algorithm, but also come up with a new data set to represent the problem better. Like I
read that paper and I was like, they're using a predictive problem as a proxy for a prescriptive problem, meaning the tech nugget at the heart of it was a regression problem. They were predicting like how many dollars it was going to cost or something like that. But they were using it to set policy. So it seemed like one of the other things that was intellectually wrong, in addition to the choice to use an algo, was what you really wanted to know was a policy, a decision-making support system. But you did a difficult intermediate step of doing a regression problem, and then you interpreted the output of that regression as a policy problem.
I was going to say, like, I think like one of the other takeaways is that, and they actually have like a follow-up paper called Predicting for A While Hoping for B, where they like revisit this paper and they talk about how one of the main takeaways is that like, you know, you need to like use it, like, so one of the challenges that before they were predicting for cost, right, as a proxy for if someone needed a bed, and obviously that was insufficient, they needed biological data. But like the selection of the data set, the selection of the labels was something that was presented as objective. So I was going to say the company involved, for example, would say something, like could possibly say something like, oh, society is biased, you know, we have biases in the way that we set up insurance payments, and thus as a result of that, like, you know, we can't help it, our model has to be biased. And I think that paper did a really good job being like, well, actually there's another data set you could have picked. There's another way you could have framed the problem that would have led to like directly like more accurate results and less biases. And I think that was a really important challenge to like a lot of machine learning people, to be like, there's no world in which you're forced to use a particular data set and you can't think creatively about how to reframe problems.
Right.
Like, you're making choices around where to source your data.
And I would say that is another subjective design choice, is what data set you think is going to be mined.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that idea.
Also, what cost function you think you're optimizing. Like if I'm treating it as a regression problem, then I'm saying, okay, like L2 loss is the thing I want to optimize. But you know, maybe there's something else, like I don't know, harms or justice.
Yeah, exactly.
In the policy which ensues.
Yeah, exactly. Or even just like, you know, there's certain things that we already understand about society and like where biases come from. So like we already know that like certain data sets are more likely to be biased than others, right? Like if we're talking about insurance costs, given the history of that, if you're talking about like housing payments or something, there's like a history to that where it's just like, okay, like if I pick this data set, there's likely to be more biases than if I pick this other data set, where it's just like, in this case, like direct biological measurements is less biased than looking at insurance costs.
Yep.
And that's something that you can infer, you can think about.
Yeah, that's
kind of
true.
critically.
Now that you mention it, that was another thing that seemed weird about the paper, is using money as the label, the thing on which you regress.
Yeah, but that's what the company was low key. That's what they were low key optimizing for, right?
Yeah.
People that would pay.
It's often where the data are available to a researcher.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Data that were produced as exhaust of some sort of business process.
I'm actually curious because your background is very much like data oriented, right? Like this data as convenience attitude, is that like a data science thing, or is that like when people start taking data in machine learning, they stop caring about? Because in machine learning,
what do you mean by
like,
data as a convenience?
Like my experience has been like machine learning engineers take whatever data is most easily available and not necessarily proactively like design and construct data sets for the sake of like a machine learning process. And it's not always the case, but it's just like
I don't know that I would say
there's like a more kind of
MLE,
like whatever's available, I take that.
Yeah, I would say that happens among researchers.
Okay.
Like researchers are happy to get their hands on any data set.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's more exciting and more publishable to look at fresh data sets.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So often you're looking at data sets that you got your hands on that nobody's ever looked at because they were produced as a purpose for doing something else.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So we used to call this data exhaust.
Yeah.
Or if you want a really old example, there's a paper called Greater and Lesser Statistics from John Chambers in 1993.
Oh my gosh.
When he was at Bell Labs.
1993.
And yes, there was a year called 1993.
It's like 20 years ago.
It was a lot.
It was more than 30 years ago.
So at Bell Labs, a lot of the things that we do today in data science are very much in the spirit of what they were doing at Bell Labs a long time ago.
What do you mean by that?
Well, like this paper, Greater and Lesser Statistics from '93. Yeah. So Chambers talks about the data that they had at Bell Labs from basically everyone talking to each other. So at the time they were like a government-tolerated monopoly on all telecommunications. Yeah. So he said, these data were not generated for the purposes of learning. However, the opportunity for learning is great.
I see.
And he was talking about transactional data, metadata from phone calls, purchase data.
Yeah, big data kind of era type thing of just accumulation.
But also data exhaust. So these data were generated in the context of people talking on phones or financial transactions. Yeah. But the applied statisticians at Bell Labs are like, oh, holy moly, we could learn all sorts of interesting stuff from these data. They weren't generated as a research tool, but we could probably learn a lot from these data. And so the data have all sorts of pathologies, and you wish that the instrument was set in a different way. But nonetheless, you can still learn a lot from it. But I feel like in tech and machine learning engineers, they often are the ones who get to instrument the system. So for example, if you're at a company that does web tracking data, at this point, it's 2021, there's probably a team that has architected the tracking in such a way that you're recording the things that you wish to be recorded, rather than teams that just happen to have their hands on some credit card data and they want to learn some new factors. So this story about the bias from financial data in hospitals, that's more like a research example where like these researchers got their hands on these data, and then they figured, okay, could we use it to look at the inequality?
No, but Optima was a product, right? It was like the algorithm to assign the beds to the patients was a product. Like the product made use of insurance data to train the model.
Yes.
And researchers came in and evaluated it and said, hey, this is a biased model.
Yes.
You should be using this other data set that's much more sort of like consciously curated for this task.
Okay.
And based off of biological markers and just sort of like more medical sort of data,
Yes.
and then it's like based off of this actual sort of more appropriate data set that's like more
lab
actively
values,
sourced, then then the bias gets heavily reduced. And I know what you're saying in the sense of like research is a little bit more careless than industry, but I do think in industry, and I also speak to like, I don't want to like reveal too much, but when I was on an applied machine learning team, there's definitely this phenomenon of like, let's just like Google images, search this concept, and just grab the data, the image results to represent this concept. And it could be like arbitrary concepts like love, loyalty, in addition to concrete concepts like cat. And they would just sort of like go to Google Images, grab whatever's there, and then use that as a representation of the concept. And part of it was really a lack of consciousness of like their decision making. Like you were sort of saying, like there's a lot of these little subjective decisions. You know, they weren't consciously realizing that like, oh, I'm making a decision about, you know, how to phrase that word from the label. Like I could use the synonym, but I didn't. You know, I could have used this. I could have searched for the Google Images. So there was a great paper where they were talking about predicting if this is a wedding or another event, and how that changes in different cultural contexts.
Sure.
So if you look up like a visual representation of the word wedding on like Google Images, it's like a very like Western perspective of a wedding, and
Yes.
that ends up sort of being the representation of the model for the concept of a wedding. But if you translate that word into like, in their case, they translated it to like some Indian language, I think Hindi. They pretty much like translated it into another language, and they had a completely different representation of what a wedding looked like. And that was a decision that the machine learning engineers did not understand that they were consciously making. Even the idea
Sounds
of
like you're talking
the
though
language
about
of the
building
label.
a product. So
Yeah,
the thing
this is part of a product development
Yeah.
process. Yeah, but I guess for research too, it works in the same way like ImageNet. Why do we have those labels for ImageNet? Okay, they're derivative from WordNet. Why do we have those?
Oh yeah, that's
why
an
do we have
amazing
that
history.
from WordNet? Yeah, it's a really interesting
and the
history.
way it's being used for purposes so very different than
Oh, for sure.
the
for
purposes
sure.
of WordNet originally.
Oh, for sure,
example.
yeah. And even like the way that they sourced the examples for ImageNet was that they went to like Bing and Google Images and they sourced images and they got them to be annotated. So they very much thought that they were coming up with representations that were authentic representations of a concept. But we now know like they weren't the best representations, right? Like there's some offensive words in there that collected pretty stereotypical images.
Yep.
There's some like artifacts in there that get confused. So like if you think of like homonyms, like I don't know, like seal and seal or whatever. Like just, you know, two words that mean the same thing. So when you source the images, they're different. There's a lot of things that we now know where we're like, why did we think that was okay? But like you kind of said something like the objectivity of data, or like I forget the phrase you used.
If there's data in it, people assume it has objectivity, and that's true both for the people who deal with the data, they want it to be objective.
Exactly.
And then for people who trust the data, they're like, oh well, there's a computer involved, so it's unbiased, right?
Yeah.
It was a thing that people would say a decade ago.
Yeah, and that's like even the data's the new oil, like building bricks, data bricks, like the language we use. I'm realizing is very tied to that assumption of data as like this objective
and I'm sure
resource.
you've heard the counter that data is actually the new plutonium.
Oh yeah, no, that's facial recognition is the new plutonium.
Oh, that's a good one.
Because it's so dangerous, right?
Yeah. Well, or people's data, like you should have an expiration policy on it. You should know how to delete it. You should understand that it's potentially harms, right? Like Paul Ohm's idea of the database of ruin. That almost any databases that you start collecting, like Latanya Sweeney illustrated, right?
Yeah.
You take a bunch of databases, and even if they seem pretty benign, you can put them together in ways that are revealing, and therefore cause harms.
Yeah,
just by creating the data set,
Yeah.
you are creating the potential for harm.
Yeah, yeah.
So in that sense, data is like plutonium.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like and the data hoarding is so much. It's like so amplified by machine learning. And that's like one of the side effects I think shocks me that people don't necessarily talk about, like with GTP-X or whatever, like these like large language models, it sort of sparked this like hoarding of text data that's like incurred all these like copyright issues and all these issues with respect to like bias, but also just in general, it's like people have found that those data sets include like people's personal information because it's just sourced from like as much of the internet as they can capture.
Which is painful because we really just don't learn. So decades ago, AOL released a bunch of search results for researchers.
Okay.
And those search results included like people's names and addresses, because one of the things that people used to do when they go into L is search their own name and their address just to see what comes up on the internet. And they just release the data. So it's like we really are not learning as a technological community.
Do you think we're not learning? Like, do you feel like...
I think we forget.
We're forgetting?
Well, absolutely. The incentives are not often around rights, harms, and justice.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So unless your incentives are around rights, harms, and justice, then you're probably going to forget the role of rights, harms, and justice in whatever it is that you're doing.
So you feel like not even in like 30 years ago or whatever, like, you know, you don't feel like there was ever a point where this conversation happened in the past where maybe we could have learned something or moved forward? Maybe not even in like the machine learning context?
No, it's worse. Those conversations were happening.
Okay.
And see, people have somehow forgot the importance of those conversations. So for example, there's a lot of conversations in the 70s around privacy.
Yeah.
But it was about state control of data.
Yeah.
It wasn't around corporate control of data.
Yeah.
So a lot of the laws that we, I think you mentioned FOIAs in passing. Where do we get FOIAs from? Well, it was concern over like overreach of state power in the 70s, right? So there were actually a lot of conversations about data and privacy decades ago. It's just that it wasn't in the context of like big.com.
Oh,
it was
for
like
sure,
.gov.
Yeah.
So that is a thing where I feel like people have forgotten that like we actually did have a sense that there was a possibility for harms just around the existence of these data sets being put together. Right? There's congressional testimony in the early 80s about this.
Wow.
But it somehow went away.
Yeah, I was going to say, I had a great conversation with someone about exactly that, like digital rights, early digital rights movement, so about like net neutrality and privacy and censorship. People were really obsessed with that and really into that, but they were thinking that it would be the governments that would be sort of the big bad guys there. And they were actually like working with corporations in order to address those challenges.
There were a lot of surprising coalitions at that time.
Yeah, exactly. But then in reality, it's like, and the person I was talking to was particularly disappointed because they were like, now like Amazon owns the internet, so like net neutrality is like, you know, in the water, and like you have like Twitter and Facebook censoring people, and privacy has just, you know, been corrupted by like Google and all these other companies. And she seemed so disappointed because she was like, we didn't realize like all of these things would happen, but just the perpetrator would be not the government.
The thing that's bad is unchecked power.
Exactly.
And it's still bad whether it's state or .com that has unchecked power. So at the time, maybe a lot of people were like, we need to fight the state because unchecked state power is bad. But what's really bad is just unchecked power, whether it's unchecked state power or unchecked corporate power.
This is why I'm so into auditing, though, like especially like third-party auditing, because it's a way to just poke from the outside to like have external accountability mechanisms of being someone that's not part of the institution, being able to kind of.
But Deb, you still have to get people to consent to get audited. So you
don't have to get consent. You still need
some
powers.
Okay, so there you go. So the power there is in state power. So presuming that the state is incentivized to audit,
you're right,
and presuming that the state chooses to take on that strong regulatory role, then yes, auditing of powers could be great.
Yeah, you're right.
But we haven't had a particularly active federal government in the realm of consumer protections the last 40 to 50 years.
Yeah.
Right?
It's time for a revival.
Word, I'm with you, but I'm with it. But we need to.
For sure. Yeah. No, I think it's also like in the context of tech as well. Like there's a lot of antitrust conversation, and I think that's allowing for some of the tech accountability conversation that finally happened too.
Correct. That is one of the few things that I think tech companies fear is genuine regulation.
Yeah. In terms of antitrust or just in general?
Antitrust seems to be the big one right now.
Yeah.
Section 230 has been mentioning more and more every year.
Yeah.
I think that seems to be more of a concern for tech companies than, say, bad PR or losing talent.
Yeah.
Recruiting and retaining talent, I would like that to be more of a factor, but it's only a factor to the extent that talent actually cares about the ethics of what their employer is doing.
Do you think they don't? I think it's definitely like a growing concern.
It's a growing concern. I will absolutely agree that it's a growing concern. It has not grown as much as it could.
It needs to be, yeah.
For it to be an entrant in the race for what are the actual sources of pain for unethical companies.
Yeah.
I don't think right now it's the biggest risk.
Okay.
I think the biggest risk is that U.S. government will turn on meaningful regulation in favor of consumer protection.
Yeah.
But I could easily imagine a day in which talented individuals, data scientists, product owners, what have you, care so much about ethics that recruiting and retaining talent becomes the biggest
main issue. Yeah. Well, I know like Facebook's been struggling to like recruit recently, just given like the series of issues that they've had, and they've also lost a lot of talent.
And where do they go?
Facebook? They're still around. They're still around.
No. I mean, the talent that Facebook doesn't hire, where do those talent go?
I'm not sure.
Do they go to companies that are more exciting, more lucrative, or more ethical?
But I think reputationally, Facebook has gotten a lot of recent big hits. Like, in terms of people have really been digging in on that particular company in the press cycle. It's just been like battered for the last like couple weeks. Not couple weeks, a couple months, I'd say, even last year. And as a result of that, like less people, it's like now not necessarily as, it's not as celebrated a situation to have gotten a job there, to like be working there. Similar with Uber and like that kind of reputational hit that they experienced. But you're right, like Uber's still here, so maybe it's not that big a deal at the end of the day. But I do think it is a lever that I hope is interesting and useful. I also think like advocacy is an interesting lever, like public, like reputational costs, not in terms of like talent and recruitment, but just in terms of like public consciousness and sort of how the public views some of these companies. I don't know how much they care, but it seems
like, does
to
that
be,
hurt them? Like if you're a publicly traded company in particular, for many of those companies, the stock price matters way more than...
Yeah, but it's like it could maybe be tied to certain clients. Like if a client gets a bad opinion of you and they leave, then that's an issue.
If you're B2B, yes. But if you're a consumer-facing company like,
I don't think Facebook is a consumer-facing. Like their main customer is like
all the various advertising.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's not like...
So that's B2B technically.
Yeah, but it's not like they have like one or two main clients.
Yeah, I understand.
There's a bazillion different people giving them money.
Yeah, I understand. For something like Amazon, it was really interesting because their facial recognition product, it did have like, it was just because it's starting, and like a lot of these like AI tools, right? Like they're at the nascent stage of the market, right? So with Amazon, they only had like a certain set of clients. Yep. So when the bad press came, they like lost those clients, and it was like they had the incentive to pull it off of the market.
That was an awkward moment where the public opinion mattered. Yeah,
there's also like invisible companies that no one will ever talk about. Like people will talk about Amazon and Microsoft, but they'll never talk about like Cognitech,
right.
or some of the more sort of like obscure names. And that also worries me a lot because those are actually the big like market share people. That are actually like influencing sort of what gets out there and what's impacting people.
And the way to get it out there is to have more investigative journalism.
Really? Is that the sort of path forward that you see?
For me, yeah. That's what I think.
Okay.
Why specifically? How do we find out about these companies? We don't find out. We don't find out about these companies because their marketing department says, get to know World Globochem. Right, we find out these companies because of investigative reporters and whistleblowers and leakers who empower the investigative reporters.
But I think also regulation could support that. Like if you had to sort of have a open procurement
the regulation
process,
is driven by the electorate, and the electorate has to care.
Yeah, that's fair. You really,
which is why I get back to this checks and balances thing. Like I really don't think that there's just one tool that's going to be the magic tool. I really think we need to like empower all of the various checks and balances we have. Corporations, deplatforming corporations, state power, the people power, but the people are the employees and also the people are the electorate. So that's the way I've been thinking about it the last couple of years is everybody needs to see what their own role is and what their own potency is.
So I guess in your mind, what's the best approach forward then? Like what's the sort of best next step given that?
It depends on the person I'm talking to. If it's a software engineer or a product owner, I want to talk to them about Deb's tools for internal auditing.
Thanks.
If it's a member of the electorate, I want to talk to them about raising their own consciousness and demanding responsibility from their elected officials. If it's somebody in the U.S. government, I want them to look at different municipalities and foreign states as models for what can work, right? And can work in a way that pleases the electorate and doesn't have some magically bad thing that happens to the economy if you do it. If they're corporations, I want them to think critically about who their partners are and ways in which that they are either performing acts that challenge their own ethics or empowering other companies to do so and think about those partnerships. And that's why I'm trying to think about like all the various checks and balances on power, right? And not just saying, oh well, the magic bullet is going to be lean economy, the FTC. It's all going to be better now, right? And also because I spend a lot of time with technologists. I just feel like there's so many technologists who collectively, are creating these tools, right? And the means of production is in their hands. So if it were the case that 5 years from now, all of the students that I teach go into the workplace and are informed, educated, demanding, and not only demand that somebody do something, but actually know what is to be done. Because I don't think these companies have like a secret room full of smart people and they're like, oh, here's how we would turn on the ethics knob. I don't think anybody has a recipe for ethics. Which is one of the reasons why your work is really valuable. But that's what educators can do too, is they can be educating people to see like, here's how to define ethics, here's how to design for ethics.
No, I think that something that's so interesting about what you're saying is just like the ecosystem of like participants involved. Like it's just to mobilize even one subset of one group of that is just so difficult. To mobilize the entirety of that ecosystem.
Deb, when you see a community of people who are with it, like actually, collectively we're 80% of the data scientists in this company. We actually could do something about that. It's really rewarding.
I was gonna say, as someone like I guess in a position to perhaps influence like people that are working under you to care about this or to take action on this, like in a decision-making role at an institution. And I guess it could also kind of like as a prof too, like you're sort of in a decision-making role on some level in terms of what your students work on.
I choose what my curriculum is.
Yeah, exactly. Your curriculum.
I try to teach things that I think students will be excited about at the same time. Like just some material that draws my attention more. I'm more likely to teach your papers, right? For example. But in the New York Times, part of it is just legitimating like what is worth thinking about and what is the ways that, so like the head of data governance and I started a Slack channel on ethics.
There's a head of data governance.
Oh yeah, and it has been for a long time at the New York Times.
Wow, that's so smart.
So we started an ethics channel on our Slack years ago.
Yeah.
And started just discussing ethical literature, things you write, and news that was wasn't ethics of corporations.
Yeah.
And so when it came time that we were like, actually, here's a specific project we're working on where we'd like to understand the ethics of it. Yeah. It wasn't from a vacuum. It was actually it was organically part of an ongoing conversation that we'd been having about tech ethics in general at other companies and U.S. regulation. Yeah. And it was not unnatural for us to think about how to turn that conversation inward and say, okay, well now let's take those critical tools and that shared vocabulary we have and apply it to these projects we ourselves are building. Yeah.
Is it more or less difficult pushing for these conversations in a context where maybe the main goal of the company is not like, it's not like a tech company or it's not an AI company, where there might be other incentives or other priorities that might draw attention away from focusing on ethics or investing in ethics? Because I think something that I hear a lot, especially even in terms of like the feasibility of internal auditing at minimum, is just like a decision maker has to prioritize it.
Correct.
And that is most likely to happen in a situation where like the main product is an AI product or an AI tool, or the sort of like primary focus of the organization is around like data practices.
I do not believe that there's a type of company which somehow existentially cannot take on ethics as part of the process.
Okay,
I agree. I do not believe that there exists a type of company where like, oh, I'm sorry, we can't be ethical because we use deep learning. We use random forest, therefore there's no ethics. I just don't believe that.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
I always am careful when I use the word should. Like, it's hard for me to say to anybody what you should do.
Yeah.
I certainly would like it. Yeah. If companies that are powerful take into account consumer protection as part of the long-term sustainability of that company. Right? Eventually, that company is going to lose talent, lose customers, face regulation if they continue not to be ethical. So it's a wise long-term move
it's a smart thing
for any company. So that I think is one framing that I think appeals to even the most hardened capitalist.
I think it's still limited, but I agree. It's appealing. Historically, what it meant for systems to work, watching that evolve today into something.
It has motivated a lot of progress. You might enjoy David Donahoe's paper, 50 Years of Data Science, which includes a lot of sections.
I read that.
Okay. So he has a long section.
Common Task Framework.
That's right. So he has a big section, which you don't see a lot about Common Task Frameworks in most papers about data science and ethics. Yeah. But he took pains to talk about how the idea of Common Task Framework has shown up in a lot of technological community and had done a lot to drive innovation. Right? And to get us aligned on what we should be aiming for. That said, as you're well aware, right, like trying to optimize this number, it turns out that there's some pathological way to optimize that number.
Yeah. No, I think there's definitely, I don't know, for me, I think there's definitely also this question of like, you kind of alluded to it earlier, but this idea of just different people with different priorities or different moral philosophies,
different values.
Different values.
It's true. It's true. Different people around the world and within one country.
Yeah.
Will
Something
have
I'm very
values.
curious about is like, what do you see as the intersection of politics and ethics, where you have different people with different values and different priorities, and sometimes that's tied to sort of like political ideologies, especially here in the U.S., where it's like everything is very heated. But I'm curious, how you see that relationship or that dynamic. Like, do you see it as like an inherently political conversation? Do you see it as a situation where it can be sort of a separate conversation where you can have two different political, like across the political spectrum, there can be some agreement on a shared set of values for what the system's supposed to adhere to? I'm curious how you see that intersection.
Both now and in the 70s, it's been a weird time of convergence.
Okay.
Where people on the right and the left sometimes are advocating for the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes coming from very different
angles.
So, for example, FERPA, which protects student information, derives from an amendment called the Buckley Amendment from a family member of William Buckley, very conservative people. So in the 70s, having privacy policy was actually supported on both the left and the right.
Okay.
Nowadays, you have both on the left and right asking, what is this Section 230? Right? And just that sort of asking, like, how did we get to a point where this law that was written in 96 as part of a Communications Decency Act is allowing any company to allow anybody to write any old thing on their platform? So it's actually a weird, some of the elements of this are actually convergent in terms of just harms. It's a place where, again, unchecked power is drawing critical attention from both left and right.
Do you have any insight into, like, that transition in terms of the awareness of like, wait, no, the bad guys are the guys that we aligned ourselves with, like, in the early days? Like, is there like any sort of like, was that an active reflection, or was just sort of like everyone that was involved in the early?
I mean, again, I would say in the 60s there was a time for a lot of people of disillusionment in the state. But it took like 20 years, right, between after World War II and by the late 1960s, post civil rights law. There was a lot of people who were just very disgruntled. Let's say 25 years after.
Do you feel like you can pinpoint where the transition went towards? It's not the state, it's actually these companies.
Oh, you mean more recently?
I don't think what was it for you, I guess? Because you've been working on data ethics for a long time. But I'm curious when for you were like, oh, this is actually, like, these companies are actually like the threat, and you need to sort of actively reorient our discussion around addressing that.
It's a good question. I mean, I can remember social media has always...
you can remember anything at all.
It's a fair point, Deb, I have to say. I can remember always finding social media a wee bit creepy. I was late to Twitter. I never took to Facebook. The whole thing just struck me as kind of icky.
Okay.
I mean, I can remember talking to Kathy O'Neill about this before her book came out, and I frankly think she was ahead of me, but we were very aligned in just thinking about unchecked power in general. And she has been critiquing unchecked power
for sure.
in a variety of guises for years.
Wall Street.
But it's hard, exactly. But it's hard to remember anything before the election. It's hard for me to remember anything before the 2016 election because, and this is how I came to be friends with Ben, actually.
Okay, nice. How?
Because Ben wrote a blog post after the election that basically said machine learning has known sin. And I reached out to a friend and said, I don't know this guy, but I want to know this person.
Machine learning's known sin?
Has known sin, which is...
Has known sin.
It's a ripoff from a quote from Robert Oppenheimer saying the physicists have known sin.
Okay.
So what his blog post said after the election is, like, now machine learners know what it's like to have a moral impact from their work.
Oh, I see.
And I just think after the election, it really just crystallized everybody's awareness. And it just totally changed the conversation because before the election, you would talk about, like, it's a little worrisome that we have all of this unchecked power around machine learning, and people say, ha ha ha, and then they would go, like, I don't know, AlexNet or something. Like, gosh, cat faces, so cool. unchecked power, bad. But look, this thing can tell a cat face.
Yeah.
So, but after the election, you would say, it's kind of worrisome that there's all this unchecked power in one place. And people would say, yeah, you're right, actually. It's kind of worrisome.
Pretty bad. Serious consequences.
So it's hard for me to remember all those conversations and moments of awareness. I mean, you and I talked about this when you and I first met. Right? I mean, within a year of your experience in New York City, like there was a lot in the press, and I was talking to you and other people from your former employer about.
No, it's definitely.
And that was before the election, so I can't remember much, but I can.
No,
remember
it was after the election. Actually, it was before the inauguration.
Really?
Yeah, it was after the election. I remember because I was in Canada during the election, and I thought it was so funny. I was like, "This is ridiculous, haha!" And then I realized I was coming to the States, and then that was like, and then I was like, "Oh, this is me.
You see how my brain is
life.
like a sieve, Deb. I can't even remember what year that was.
I actually think you're like a year ahead. Like your timelines are off by like a consistent
one?
factor. Like you were like, oh, Google started here. I'm like, actually no, it started the year before. So I think you're just, it's like a off by one, standard error.
Just fact check everything I say. And with that, I should probably go pick up my kids.
No worries. What time is it?
13:41.
Okay.
Hi, it's Jerry Michalski again, StoryThreading UNFINISHED21. This session between Chris and Deborah is extremely geeky. Now, I'm a geek, but this is kind of above my pay grade. In fact, about 8 minutes into the session, I had to stop playing and go do a bunch of research and move things around in my brain so that I could, in fact, StoryThread a little bit better. But I'm giving it my best swing here. Second thing is, it's certainly not outside my awareness that I am a white guy. And the opening conversation here in the session is about algorithmic bias and what people of color notice from technology that people like me didn't notice they had baked right into the technology. And this is a super interesting topic under the big umbrella of the ethics of big data, the ethics of artificial intelligence, all of those sorts of things. So with that as background, let's kind of dive in. So the session is titled "The House is on Fire," and I think that's meant to echo Greta Thunberg talking about to the members of the European Parliament to panic like the house is on fire, something that they're not really doing yet. And I haven't been following COP26 very much, which is happening right this minute, just starting, but I hope that they do because the house is in fact on fire. So that was really interesting, and I put this this session under ethics of big data and some of the other topics I just mentioned, and that comes down to things like algorithmic bias. And so, for instance, here's the Algorithmic Justice League, which Deborah Raji is a founder of and part of. And so we'll find our way back here to this session, The House is on Fire, and then up to Chris Wiggins, a data scientist who has written for the New York Times, is on the faculty at Columbia, and has done a bunch of interesting things as well. During this session, they talked about a lot of academic papers, and I tried to capture most of those papers. So here's 50 years of data science, and unfortunately I've got them collected alphabetically, but you'll notice if you watched the session. So this is by David Donahoe, and in the beginning, in the introduction of this paper, they mentioned an earlier paper called The Future of Data Analysis by an early thinker named John Tukey, a statistician and mathematician who did really interesting things, including coined the term bits for binary digits. But if we go back to 50 years of data science, that's one of many papers they mention. This one mentions the Common Task Framework. It happens late in the session. But here's Greater or Lesser Statistics, a Choice for Future Research, written by J.M. Chambers, also a statistician who was part of the Project R. If you've ever done statistics in the modern era, you've probably used R. He invented the programming language S, and R is its successor. He was at Bell Labs, which is basically a birth garden for all sorts of famous and useful technologies. If you're a technologist, anyone who was at Bell Labs during the golden era is a little bit in the pantheon of gods, I'm afraid. And then they also mentioned an article by Jim Balsillie, Data is not the new oil, it's the new plutonium. I think that's the article they were pointing to. They just mentioned that data is like plutonium, and I liked in his article there was a summary that data is amazingly powerful, dangerous when it spreads, difficult to clean up, and with serious consequences when improperly used. This is to countervail the very popular notion that data is the new oil, which is a popular thing these days. meant to imply that all this data science and big data is going to lead to large deposits of highly valuable stuff that companies should hoard and then meter out in some way, that's their chief source of profits. I have a draft of a piece that I need to finish writing titled Data is the New Soil, talking about soil fertility and how, in fact, if we have sovereign separated data where we own it and release it and maintain it and make it better, that's actually much better for the commons and for humanity. But that gets us off a little bit off the topic over here. They also mentioned a couple other papers, the Critique and Contribute paper, a practice-based framework for improving critical data studies and data science. I had never heard of critical data studies, so I added this paper, I added that. I added the authors of this paper, except I already had Gina Neff in my brain as a sociologist, married to Philip Howard, and the writer of Surviving the New Economy and Venture Labor and Self-Tracking. So all of those basically wove their way into the content here. But I want to go back to the bias question that comes up like immediately and early and just say, hey, this is actually a really important thing. If you've done any kind of image compression, so there's a standard test image for image processing called Lena, and it's named after Lena Söderberg. The image looks like this. Kind of speaks for itself. This was a Playboy Playmate. So Lena Söderberg was a Playboy Playmate back in the day. She basically becomes this image that the men inventing better image processing routines pass around kind of as an inside joke as part of trying to make this technology better. If bias and sexism and other things could be baked in more deeply, I guess they could, but this is not a happy start, and this is not an example that Deborah Chris mentioned in their conversation, but it's the first thing that came to my head. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm familiar with this kind of stuff. They also talked about ImageNet and AlexNet and a bunch of other projects which I've connected in here, but aren't sort of really big ways to go. But one thought, and by the way, there's a little scroll bar here, so I've connected up to more and more things. One thing that I kept coming back to that I then elaborated more in my brain, which was, and the critiques here are not just about Facebook, but Facebook is a particularly great example to sit and talk about. So the question is, why is Facebook dangerous? So Facebook is actually the largest country on Earth. Facebook has more monthly average users than the populations of China plus India. And that's counting all the old people, all the children, all the people who might not be on social networks. So somehow Facebook grew that large with no oversight. So the question here emerges, if you think of Facebook as a country, what changes? How do you start thinking differently about it? So first, Facebook is huge. Second, users are busy pouring deeply personal information into Facebook all the time in enormous and unbelievable quantities. It turns out that the ability to see who was at the party, what everybody's lives are like, the ability to easily like, connect, share, upload, record, all those kinds of things is incredibly addictive. And in fact, addiction was baked into the frameworks. But then, probably worst of all, Facebook's business model, algorithms, and policies entrench echo chambers and fuel the spread of misinformation. That's one piece about why Facebook is dangerous that's really important today to the topic at hand. And then I found a quote, Facebook is Chernobyl. This is a quote by my friend Michalski. Facebook is Chernobyl, a badly designed nuclear reactor that makes a lot of energy and money for its owner by harnessing the inherent power of connecting atoms and people to each other, but without more external oversight and regulation will keep producing toxic effects. Seems like a nice summary of these various topics that we're talking about. So in the conversation, they went around to lots of different perspectives on how these systems kind of break. So Deb says, if you Google wedding, you get a really very Western representation of weddings. And then if you do it in Hindi and maybe having to do the search from India, you'll probably get a very different look and feel for what wedding means. So a lot of people, a lot of researchers just use Google searches to come up with databases, thinking that if it came out of the computer, it's probably neutral or objective. And it turns out that not so objective. That wasn't really happening. There's a lot of geekiness here about how to actually try to create objectivity in data and in the algorithms. Which data set you choose matters. that often machine learning engineers use the data that is most easily available instead of the right data, that incentives are not aligned around rights, harms, and justice. And then some question about how to go about creating remedies, like reputational damage is what's happening right now. We're seeing a lot of techlash, a lot of backlash against the tech giants. But is that enough reputational damage? Their stock prices are still flying. They still own the companies. They're still directing them in different ways. And then there was early in the conversation, there's this interesting topic about third-party AI algorithm audits, a topic I did not have in my brain. I had a little bit about auditing, and I did have the topic of how do we keep AI from being a threat. And so I spent a lot of the conversation thinking about this question. How do we keep AI and these massive platforms from being a threat to us, and how do we make them more useful? One of my remedies for Facebook in particular is this question. What if Zuckerberg had designed Facebook for citizens instead of consumers? So Facebook is this giant addiction engine that sells off our data and stalks us and a bunch of things like that. What if instead Facebook had been created for citizens whose job is to think together about the problems of the day, to have autonomy and sovereignty over their own data, and then to participate in the public space, in the public sphere? At this point, Zuckerberg has made a big deal. In fact, in the last couple of days, Zuckerberg declares the metaverse as Facebook's next big initiative. They renamed the outside company as Meta in order to make that point a little bigger. But their idea of the metaverse is this consumer metaverse that sucks. And if instead the metaverse were more like what I'm showing you here, a network of ideas and concepts and evidence, but not just mine, and here we're stuck because I've been feeding this brain for 24 years, but I wish I were doing this collaboratively with other people. I haven't been, but I want to, and I've got a passion project right now to try to do that. What if that was the metaverse we were walking into, so that as part of our civic activities, we could have conversations as I've been trying to have with you, StoryThreading UNFINISHED21. Now, my story threads are pretty one way. I'm recording these. At some point you listen to them. There isn't an easy back channel for you to talk back with me, but there could be. And the medium itself could in fact be the back channel and help us make that back channel. So all of these things kind of swirl together into the big juicy topic that Chris and Deb put in front of us in The House is on Fire. And I hope this has given you a couple of new avenues to pursue. And when you see the link to this spot in the brain, you'll be able to come back and look up all of the studies they mentioned and other sorts of things. Some of the studies and posts I'm not sure I got right. So for example, at one point, Chris says that machine learning has known sin, which is a riff on J. Robert Oppenheimer's quote, "Physicists have known sin after the Trinity explosion and the bombing of Hiroshima." And I found this piece by Ben Dixon, and I'm not sure this is the right Ben that they refer to in the session, but I'll be happy to change this and correct it to the right one should that feedback get to them and get back to me. For now, I'm very happy to spend this time with you, and thanks for watching.